The breaking of the Berlin Wall in 1989 signified the first break of the Iron Curtain, foreshadowing the fall of the USSR soon after. Though the crumbling of the Soviet Union was a summation of several worldwide social-political and economic movements, it found its true origins in one place, Poland. It began with the Polish Solidarity Movement, a trade union turned global socio-political revolution. Failed communist economic policy had saddled the Polish working class with rampant unemployment, food shortages, and economic instability. Solidarity was born as a single strike, hoping to obtain rights for local workers. It quickly grew into a national labor union, the first independent trade union in the Soviet bloc. As the movement grew, so did its representation, as it pushed forth the revolutionary wills of Greater Poland, workers, intellectuals, and students alike. Despite facing staunch governmental suppression, Solidarity broke barriers by championing nonviolent change through economic, religious, and socio-political avenues. In gaining national support, Solidarity shattered pre-existing political restrictions enforced by the communist government. Its eventual achievement of free elections set forth the eventual toppling of the Soviet Union and the breaking of the Iron Curtain. The rise of the Soviet Union began at the end of World War II. With the fall of Nazi Germany, both the communist USSR and the capitalist USA sought to establish spheres of influence in the newly rebuilding Europe. Tensions between the former wartime allies grew rapidly, sparking the Cold War. Separating communism from capitalism was the Iron Curtain, a physical and ideological barrier that completely separated communication and interaction between the two sides. As the Soviets exercised their expanded influence on Eastern Europe, the economic and social effects of communism were soon manifested in the USSR's newly established satellite states. As tyranny reigned, however, poverty, corruption, censorship, and religious suppression followed. The authoritarian Soviet governments employed a variety of self-serving political barriers, such as martial law, corrupt bureaucracies, unfair elections, and the passing of autocratic laws. These actions suppressed the rights of the ordinary people, left with no way of bringing upon political change or justice. The Soviet Union created numerous social barriers, making it nearly impossible to achieve reform. Public assembly was banned, and censorship was heavily implemented, making any form of dissent punishable. Without vocal opposition, communist governments artificially increased the prices of goods and services while keeping wages the same. This led to several economic barriers for the general population, such as mass poverty, low job security, and an unstable reliance on government-based food stamps, which only furthered Soviet dominance. Religious freedoms in the USSR were also highly subdued through anti-religious campaigns. The USSR never explicitly outlawed religion, but their policies actively suppressed it, particularly Catholicism, a consistent critic of communism. Soviet policies took land from churches, cut off church funding, and restricted clergymen from accessing training for ministry positions. Though the Soviet ruling powers fielded significant support, particularly among the elites of society, many felt estranged from their governments. These tended to be the working class, who bore the brunt of corrupt politicians and their failing economic policies. These people were subject to the strongest barriers offered by Soviet control, and one of the most tragic examples existed in Poland. In the late 1970s, Poland was marred by social and economic unrest. The Polish government continually took out loans from foreign governments to build up infrastructure. However, due to immense corruption, very little of this money was put towards the country. This failing economic policy was directly felt by the Polish people, with many laborers being laid off while food stamps were at an all-time low. This mixture of poor living conditions, drastic unemployment, and lack of goods and services spurred the working class's demand for better living conditions and economic opportunity. These demands manifested into a strike on August 14, 1980, at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland. Lech Walesa, a charismatic activist and former electrician at the shipyard, took charge. News of the strike broke through governmental censorship to the rest of Poland. As the month of August dragged on, other shipyards joined the Lenin shipyard in their strike. By the end of the month, almost 200 other labor groups had joined, showing the support for the Lenin shipyard workers. The popular support of the Polish people and other striking groups encouraged the Gdansk workers to hold out their strike. On August 31, 1980, the government caved in and signed the Gdansk Agreement, a social contract listing 21 reforms that gave the Polish people an avenue of bringing upon democratic change. They had broken through a significant social barrier, one that had trapped the Polish people for over the last 30 years. The agreement allowed for the legal establishment of a trade union independent of the communist regime, gave workers the right to strike, and ensured a proper supply of resources for them. In doing so, there would be a clear representation of workers' needs and rights, previously unseen in the USSR. Encouraged by the success of the Gdansk Agreement, Lech Walesa established a national trade union, Solidarity. The movement swept the nation's working class, but as it grew in members, it also grew its purpose. As students, intellectuals, and other laborers were drawn to solidarity, the sheer power of the organization grew, with many sub-organizations forming. At its peak in early 1981, 10 million citizens, representing over 80% of the Polish workforce, had voluntarily joined the organization. They sought to slash away at government supremacy, pushing for further economic reform, the firing of corrupt officials, and free elections. Organized nonviolent strikes became an important tool for breaking socioeconomic barriers and slowly loosening the communist regime's grip on society. Solidarity strikes across the country grew increasingly coordinated and powerful. In a last-ditch response, the Polish government declared martial law in 1981, using military force to strike against the Solidarity movement. Nonviolent demonstrators who resisted were at risk. 12 were killed by the Polish government in protests between May and December of 1982, and tens of thousands were arrested. By 1982, Solidarity was officially banned. However, it had continued to operate as a thriving underground organization. Members of the underground movement risked harsh punishments and constant pursuit by the government security service. Within a few years, for example, the leaders of one Solidarity Commission were imprisoned for terrorism. Nevertheless, Solidarity persevered. Radio Solidarity was created, allowing Solidarity ideals to perpetuate on the airwaves. By 1983, there were already over 500 different Solidarity newspapers. Street protests continued to be organized. Smaller-scale communication and coordination of ideas often relied on person-to-person handwritten notes and events. This practice helped further unify protesters in a single anti-government movement, preventing its dissipation while underground and working against the social barriers created by censorship. Underground Solidarity broke significant religious barriers. Though the communist government sought to drive a wedge between the primarily Catholic population and their church, the church began to push back. Then Pope John Paul II was originally Polish and drew unfathomable levels of popularity from his homeland. His papal trips to the country lifted the spirit of a population suffering economically, and his open support of Solidarity extended support of the movement. While Solidarity remained banned, public support only intensified as people grew increasingly frustrated with economic despair and a controlling government. Under popular pressure, on September 11, 1986, the Polish government released hundreds of political prisoners previously connected to Solidarity. The union banded back together. Under Walesa's leadership, the union now represented much more than just labor demands. They were a direct opposition to communism and sought to break through even more barriers. In the late 1980s, Poland's government ultimately resisted economic change, leading to unstable jobs and pay. Resulting in a shortage economy, food prices were hiked up by 40% and millions were left starving. This unstable economic climate gave rise to a new set of strikes. Despite military shutdowns, the sheer level of and support for the ever-increasing number of strikes forced the Polish government into negotiation with Walesa and his followers. They were invited to the Polish Roundtable Talks of February 1989. They met with members of the communist government and representatives from the Catholic Church. Debating social, political, economic, and religious issues, the conference gave the Solidarity movement permission to officially field candidates for upcoming elections. Solidarity had begun cracking the long-standing political barrier that kept the Communist Party in power. With immense popular support, the Solidarity Party won virtually every seat in both legislative houses. Soon after, on August 24, 1989, the Polish legislature elected a non-communist Polish prime minister. With the fall of the communist regime in Poland, a new constitution was drafted and was adopted soon thereafter. In December of 1990, Lech Walesa was elected as the first president of Poland, determined to rebuild the damaged economy of the turmoil-ridden country. Inspired by the end of communism in Poland, neighboring Soviet bloc countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia followed suit, dispelling their communist regimes. The USSR disbanded in 1991 and the Iron Curtain was lifted. While the fall of the Berlin Wall is often remembered as the climax of the USSR's story, Lech Walesa and the Solidarity movement were vital to this change, inspiring thousands across Eastern Europe and even in Berlin. They spearheaded a new age of free thinking and prosperity, lighting the spark that blew up the USSR and communism. Solidarity thrived in the 1980s and 1990s, growing from a small movement focused on acquiring better food prices to an internationally recognized political and socioeconomic force that sought to overthrow communism. The ideas behind the movement, such as nonviolence and self-governance, continued to live on in the Polish people and allowed the Solidarity movement to break the impregnable clutches of communism, breaching a barrier that had divided the world in two.